Okay, we'll get started. So as I said earlier, this is Andy's presentation, which I'm reading out, and we'll ask Andy to have some comment on some of that, and also James as we go through. And as you're thinking of questions, you can type them in the Q&A box. James, are you able to access the Q&A box from where you are?
Yep, I'm keeping an eye on that at the moment.
Okay, you might be able to perhaps check that for me, because I can only multitask in two things.
Absolutely, yep. I'll keep on it.
And perhaps if you'll be able to address specifically some horse health things out of there as well, yep. And if there's some land management ones. Okay, now we've got to make this work. Okay, so Andy is a land management consultant. As I said, we'll pass on his contact details afterwards. Do you want to say hello to everyone, Andy?
Yeah, hello, and I hope you can hear me clearly.
So is that okay, James?
Yep, I got him.
Good. Okay, well, I'll rest the phone there. Excellent. And James, would you like to introduce yourself as well? You don't have a sort of slide like Andy does.
No, that's okay. So I'm Dr. James Meyer. I think I've got a few of my clients are on here tonight. So I run Fleurieu Equine Clinic down on the Fleurieu Peninsula, and we do all horsework, x-rays, dentals, lamenesses. We've got ultrasound. We're fully portable. Everything comes out in the field. So I'm just here to answer any horse health questions related to weeds tonight.
Excellent. And there'll be a few of those popping up after this rain.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the presentation tonight, just starting off with a couple of references that you can download afterwards, and I'll also send that link in a follow-up email. Then we'll go through some common problem plants and weeds, and hopefully we'll draw on James's experience there as well. And then approaches to weed control, and this will be tricky because there will be some chemicals perhaps that I'm not very good at pronouncing, but there we go. Okay, so we've got a couple of popular, or this one particularly, Plants Poisonous to Horses. It's actually a free download. So we'll send the link through to you because the Australian Horse Industry Council's actually just updated their website. The document's still on there, but it's just a little bit different field link.
That book is absolutely fantastic. I use it as a reference myself for different things. It's wonderful.
Good. Yeah, and then if you match that with downloading an app, you know, Weed ID app onto your phone, of which there are quite a few, that helps you sort of join the dots. And failing that, social distancing approved, you can always visit your local natural resources management office, and there'll be staff in there that can do plant identification as well. Okay, so that's another useful reference. That web link, which again I'll send a live link through, goes through to a whole page on PIRSA that's full of all different information about weed control. That book's actually quite useful, the booklet, because it gives you, I'll call it dosage rates. Dosage rates of chemical combinations and how to administer it. See, I've got more veterinary language than land management language. Oh, they've got a couple of apps there that Andy's put up as well. So, yeah, like I said, there's quite a few, and no doubt if you Google around, there's even more, but try and have cropping or pasture weeds is really what we're after, not garden weeds. Okay, here we go. So the first one's perennial ryegrass, and got some cultivators of the ryegrass contain a fungus which affects the nervous system of animals, causing grass staggers, and it's particularly horses and alpacas that are suspect to this. And we've got some symptoms listed there. So when you're sowing new pasture, you have to look for an endophyte one that's low in endophytes. So I might ask Andy to just speak to the perennial ryegrass selection, and then we'll ask James to talk about if he's come across the grass staggers before. So Andy, away you go.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Look, it is important with horses that understanding of the impacts of some perennial ryegrasses. Some of the older pastures have a wild type endophyte which can produce a toxin, which obviously produces the staggers and trembling, loss of balance. It's not usually fatal, but horses can injure themselves. So if you have that situation, you need to move them out of that paddock straight away, put them onto a paddock which is obviously has low toxicity impact. Something like Cotswold's a really good one. But if you're going to reseed a pasture, you must look for the low endophyte varieties. Now, Oslic's a low endophyte one. Also, you can plant that or sow it down to about 550 mil rainfall, which is good. But the other ones which will have no toxins, they may have the endophyte fungus in them, but they don't produce the toxins, are AR1 varieties. So Arrow and Bronx have been around for yonks, but they also come out as an AR1 type, and they're the ones you need to look for if you're actually sowing perennial-based pasture for horses.
Okay, Andy, you've actually come across something there, or something you mentioned called rainfall. So hopefully everybody listening in knows the rainfall for where their property is, because you'll have different grasses or weeds that might be talked about tonight, and like all sorts of plants, they have preferential for different rainfall zones. So, so where would you find out about rainfall, Andy?
If you go up to the Bureau of Meteorology sites and look for their online data, you can actually search for your nearest town and that'll come up with the average annual rainfall for you.
That's excellent, because even if you're talking to consultants and things, you need to know what your rainfall is. Okay, anything from you, James, that you've come across with this?
Yeah, Andy's covered quite a bit of it. Obviously, I have seen a few cases of ryegrass staggers. I'm not sure if we're going to talk about annual as well as perennial, but they can present reasonably similarly. They aren't usually fatal, although if horses are severely affected enough, we may have to euthanize. They don't always recover. And obviously, it's not just your pastures, it's your hays as well, and it can last for quite some time in hay. So either's an issue.
That's actually good for raising that, James, because although we're talking about plant identification in pastures, the skill level to identify plants also has to apply to hays as well, and perhaps even sometimes to chaff. So depending how it was made or who made it. But so again, some of those apps and the books having handy is really useful. Okay, there you go, James. Annual ryegrass. So Andy, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, look, this is a problem with a particular type of annual ryegrass, which is called Wimmer ryegrass. It's been planted for yonks. Occasionally you can get an outbreak of this. It's called annual ryegrass toxicity. It's caused by a bacteria associated with a nematode, and at certain conditions, time of the year, you can get outbreaks of this. It can be fatal, this one, and it can be fatal to all livestock. Generally speaking, primary industries and similar authorities are on top of this as soon as they see an outbreak, and everybody's warned in the region. But it is one to be very, very wary of. If you're going to plant any annual ryegrasses, the short-term Italian ryegrasses don't have this problem, and there's one called safeguard ryegrass, which is an annual, which regenerates itself with viable seed. That can be used, and that one also is quite safe for horses. So just be aware of that one. Anything
to add to that, James?
No, that's pretty much covered it.
Okay, so as Andy mentioned there, it's really difficult quite often to get information from primary industries through to the horse industry, because most of us are not on what we call farming networks. PIRSA does have a news page, which recently just had the Kunjun virus alert on it, and they also have a Twitter account, which is mostly where I hear of things first. So as part of the follow-up email, I might send the links to their Twitter account. I think they've got LinkedIn, but don't have Facebook. So for the horse industry, it's quite hard to get messages through sometimes. Okay, oh, that's the follow-up second slide, which we've addressed. Probably the other thing on there is you can get pasture hays and pastures identified properly through SARDI, which is South Australian Research Institute. That's at Waite there, is it, Andy? Yes, so Waite Institute, Urbray. They do all sorts of testing there and certainly do that. So if you're not sure, and you might be buying a property and you're just wondering what's there, certainly can have it tested. Okay, we've got Cape Tulip now. Andy, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, look, this is one you do need to be really careful of, and it is quite common, particularly around the hills side. It's got a very nice orange flower, and it looks very nice in the spring when it flowers, but it can be potentially quite harmful and fatal to animals. It's also a declared weed, which means that you do have to try and control it. It's difficult to control because it's got a very deep core. You can see that in the photo there. If you try and dig them out, the chances are you'll leave a part of that core behind, it'll regrow. So you really are forced into a situation where if you've got sort of fairly large patches of it, you're going to have to go to a herbicide brush off, which is the herbicide, the chemical name is methyl. That's one which will knock it out. And the other one is 2,4-D-amine. If you apply those in June to September, you should have a reasonable amount of success. But you might need to keep on this for a good couple of years before you get all of it and possibly even go to a third year. But it's definitely one that you need to control. James,
have you got any comment on this one?
Yeah, I haven't really seen any cases of Cape Tulip poisoning, and I think they're pretty rare in horses. But if it is going to occur, they're cardiac glycosides, so they're going to affect the heart muscle. So you might see, and it might be as simple as a horse looking like it's got poor performance, a bit dull and depressed. So it's certainly, it might not strike you straight away, but it's got some pretty serious consequences. So management is definitely better to be proactive with that.
Yeah, and I guess the case I heard of is quite old now, but there was an endurance ride on and all the horses got turned out into a night paddock that unfortunately had Cape Tulip in. So you got horses stressed in a different paddock, stressed from the event, and quite a few died. So I'm not sure if that's online. It was before Facebook time. But that's certainly, if you're checking new paddocks and animals or horses enter paddocks and they're stressed, it's a new place and whatever, and if there's anything toxic in there, it's like grab and run. You've seen horses grab mouthfuls and run of anything. So that's one situation where this kind of plant will get your horse into trouble. Okay, moving on to Marshmallow. Andy, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, look, Marshmallow is quite a common weed. Generally speaking, horses tend not to eat it. It's fairly unpalatable. It tends to pop up where pastures have been overgrazed. It's one of those that quickly comes in, a bit like capeweed. Sweating, rapid breathing, staggers, etc. Now, this one's not that easy to get rid of. People try all sorts of herbicides, and often they're just inappropriate. These plants can get really big, and they can become almost woody. And you need to treat these plants as a woody weed. So there's only a few of them, just dig them out. If there's a lot of them and they're quite old and woody, you need to go to a woody weed killer such as Grazing on DS. If you're looking to try and control large patches of young seedlings, then you're going to need to use a broadleaf spray. And just applying something like Camber M or 2,4-D-amine, which are two of the common ones you'll find in the rural retailers, isn't going to work on its own. You need to mix it with hammer. Once you've mixed hammer and 2,4-D-amine, or you can use hammer and Camber M, then it becomes effective. And you will almost certainly need to add a wetter to make sure it actually sticks to the leaves. But so many people try all sorts of different herbicides to try and get this one, and it's quite ineffective. You need to mix those two, hammer and 2,4-D-amine.
So, James, there's definitely been cases, I think, in South Australia with this, hasn't there?
I don't know about so many. Yes, no, I take that back. A couple of years ago, yes, there was some published studies. I was thinking of the Melbourne ones, but I'm pretty sure Adelaide Uni piggybacked onto that with a couple of cases that they'd had. Theirs were horses that had been put in, I think one of them had been put in like a cattle yard or something that was just overgrown with marshmallow weed and didn't really have much else to graze, and then presented with colic symptoms that then they ended up euthanizing and doing postmortems because they didn't progress. So yes, definitely can be a problem. Usually, as Andy said, horses don't tend to selectively graze it. It's really got to be their last resort, and so getting onto it early and not allowing horses access to any largely affected areas should keep you pretty safe with that one.
Excellent. Okay, Andy, next slide is cakeweed.
Yeah, no, cakeweed is a really, really common weed, and most of the reasons for it being in horse paddocks is because the whole pasture has been overgrazed. It's one of the first ones which will colonise that area. By and large, small levels of cakeweed in a pasture are not a major issue. But if you put a horse into a paddock which is just full of cakeweed and that's all it's got to eat, then there's the possibility of getting nitrate poisoning. It's particularly bad if you have just fertilised a paddock where you've got a nitrogen-based fertiliser. So just be aware of that. And when you're trying to knock this out, you can use Amoside 65, which is a 2,4-D herbicide. These are commonly used in conjunction with a lot of heavy grazing to knock out these plants. So just be aware that when someone suggests you this whole idea of spraying on a herbicide and then putting some heavy grazing pressure on, you should not do that with horses. With sheep, it's okay. With cattle, it's okay generally. But just avoid this notion of spraying with something like 2,4-D amine or Camber M and then putting a lot of horses on to graze out these things. You're better off just letting the herbicide do its work. Make sure you apply a wetter if you need to. But if you use things like Tigrex, Ag-Trine MA early in the season, about 4 to 6 weeks after the opening rains in autumn, that would generally knock them out and leave your grasses intact. If you do happen to have a property near next to vines, and that's sort of within 10 to 15 kilometres away, you should use Jaguar, so it's registered for use in vineyards. The other two can do damage to vines, the Ag-Trine MA and Tigrex.
So, Andy, did you want to explain how spray drift gets into the paddock next door?
Yeah, so there's two issues when you're doing a lot of spraying. One is spray drift, where the droplets are so fine that if you do it on a windy day, it literally drips from your paddock into your neighbour's paddock. Now, that's a pretty obvious thing. What's not known by a lot of people is the notion that some herbicides are volatile, and particularly in warm weather, they can vaporise. So if you're spraying something like Ag-Trine, MA or Tigrex, they've got a chemical in there called MCPA, which is volatile. So it can actually vaporise, it can float up into the atmosphere, and it can drift along for many kilometres, and in the cool of the evening, it actually drops down onto nearby pastures, and it happens to be a vineyard paddock, then it will drop onto the vineyard to the vines and do a lot of damage. So that's how they work. And there's quite a number of herbicides which you can use which are described as volatile herbicides. Anything which has a term ester after it, 2,4-D ester, is a highly volatile herbicide, and you need to do some research and make sure you don't sort of have any off-target damage.
That's pretty handy to keep friendly with your neighbours. James, any comments on this one?
Yeah, as Andy said, obviously one of the most common weeds that will pop up around now as we start to get our first rains on usually overgrazed pastures. It's a coloniser, so it comes up first. Usually it will mainly just cause things like diarrhea in horses and cattle. So we just generally try not to graze it, spray it early. And, you know, if you're keeping up with your pasture rotation, spraying and seeding, it's usually not too much of an issue. It's usually when you get overgrazing and first growth in the season that you have a problem with it.
Yeah, and I'd also flag for those people that are on fire-affected properties. the Salvation Jane, which will come up soon, and this weed, and maybe others you haven't seen for a lot of years will definitely be popping up ahead of Pasture. Oh, there's Salvation Jane. Away you go, Andy.
Yeah, so this one's, we don't see a lot of it as much as we used to. We used to see the hillsides absolutely covered on them in the springtime. But we do have a lot of agents out there, biological agents, which have really done quite a good job. But this one is toxic, and certainly it's a liver toxic. It's toxic to all livestock and horses. You often won't see the impacts on with sheep because they generally don't last more than a few months in the case of lambs, and probably 5 or 6 years in the case of ewes. But it's potentially quite fatal, or can be fatal. It's relatively easy to control if you keep on it. Because it's a broadleaf annual, it'll pop up with the rains that come in late April. And you've got an opportunity then to use the same sort of herbicides that you use for cakeweed. They will knock it out and keep your grasses intact and also keep your clover intact. But the other thing to remember is that you do get a second germination around the springtime, so it's worthwhile going out and actually checking again to see how much the seed has germinated again in the springtime and try and knock it out then as well.
Okay, I've just flipped the slide over, Andy. So we've got the different biological controls there. So hopefully people that have got horse paddocks and maybe have had Salvation Jane, or even in the district, and you go for a walk in the evening with your dog and you have a look and just have a look at how, if there's any of these sort of attacking the plants as you go around. Have you got anything else to add to this, Andy?
No, look, all of those are actually quite freely available and they're out in these paddocks. Certainly the crown weevil and the root boring weevil appear to do a lot of damage, but there's quite a lot of evidence now that the flea beetle and pollen beetle are also doing a really good job. So collectively, yes, they seem to be working, and people don't have to use the sprays as we used to.
Okay, you've listed this weed as a declared weed. Do you want to let everybody know what a declared weed, what does that mean?
Yeah, so certain weeds are declared by state governments effectively because they can cause a lot of agricultural damage or environmental damage, and they're seen as those which the individual landholder should make an effort to control. They could be weeds which are highly toxic. They can be weeds which can create a problem for cereal crops and so forth, where we don't want these in the crops, damaging them. So there's a whole host of reasons why they are unattractive weeds, if you like. They get listed. If they're listed as a declared weed, then you need to control it. Now, sometimes they can be classified as you must control it, or you can't sell it, or you can't move certain types of product. For example, hay can't be moved from one place to another. So a lot of restrictions when it comes to declared weeds. So but you can look that up at any of the primary industry sites, and they'll describe to you what declared weeds are.
So just a reminder, if you have some questions, if you could use the Q&A box, we'll actually address those at the end.
So I've got one, just there's one that's popped up that seems relevant at the moment, Andy. I know that you can buy dung beetles. Can you buy any of these biological controls for Salvation Jane?
Yeah, well, most of these are actually put out by the Natural Resources Management Boards. So they have programs in place where they will actually release these. So my understanding is that if you wanted to actually be involved and get some on your property, you'd have to contact one of the Natural Resource Management officers and talk to them to see what their projects, where they're working their projects, to see whether or not they would be prepared to put any on their land. That's my understanding. I don't know that you can actually buy them.
On from that, if anybody is trying to control parasitic problems such as like red-legged earth mite or something like that, and they're using an insecticide, will that kill off these as well as things like dung beetles?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. one, they probably would. Generally speaking, we suggest to people that they're using sprays, they don't spray the whole paddock out, that they leave strips. So you've got a strip of salvation jane which literally acts as a harbour for these insects. There is that possibility you'll destroy them.
Okay, thank you. Right, Guildford grass, Andy.
Yeah, now look, this one's an interesting one because it's not actually a grass. It's actually a bulb, and you can see that bottom left-hand picture. It looks like a tiny little onion. It develops these little sort of pinkish flowers in the spring. It's a tough, leathery bulb, and it produces quite a lot of seeds in that little seed head you can see on the top right there. Its issue is, if you actually go to the next slide, you can actually see these fibre balls. Now, occasionally, if you put a horse into a paddock or cattle into a paddock, and that's all they've got to eat, they will end up eating quite a bit of this really tough, fibrous Guildford grass. And with some animals, it gets turned into this fibre ball. And of course, once you get that, they're a bit like, this one's about the size of a softball on the right. They're quite light, but they will block the intestines. And if you block the intestines of animals, then the likelihood is that they will die. So in this particular case, the problem occurs because people don't do anything with their paddock in terms of fertility and liming. They just leave them. The phosphorus level drops. They become quite acidic, and that encourages this particular Guildford grass. So the key with this is to make sure your phosphorus levels are up. So obviously we've talked about doing some soil testing. Make sure that you lime if you've got a highly acidic soil. And if it's really dense, you can actually spray it out. There's only one, or there's a couple of herbicides that are effective. But if you go to the next slide, you'll actually see that you can use metsulfuron and methyl, which is called brush off. And as long as you apply that into the July or even early July, that will knock it out. But you also need to make sure, as I said, build your phosphorus levels up, make sure you lime the soil. So
really it's a plant of poor pastures.
Absolutely.
Excellent. James, have you come across anything with that one?
No, I haven't directly come across any cases of that. Andy, there's a question here. This is different to onion grass, isn't it? Guildford grass?
Yes, yeah. Well, this has got, it's called Guildford grass, and some people call it onion grass, but and then there's onion weed. Now, the onion weed is a very different plant. That grows up almost like it's got sort of tall leaves, a little bit like the Guildford grass, but it's almost like a succulent. It has a sort of a different flower on the top. So yeah, they are different. It's almost a whitish type of flower on the onion weed. It's a different plant. So it's Guildford grass is its common name.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, now we've got barley grass, Andy.
Yeah, so barley grass is, funnily enough, barley grass is actually quite productive for sheep and cattle farmers. And it gives you some good ground cover during the growing season, but its problem is when it heads off. These really sharp sort of seed heads can create all sorts of problems with sort of eyes and ears and teeth, and it's a very, very common problem. You can slash it. You can graze it heavily with sheep. If you've got the right sort of fences, you can do some spray topping. That's an interesting concept where you use a very, very low rate of herbicide like glyphosate. And when these little seed heads are forming, the seeds are actually forming inside. And whilst they're quite young and immature, if you spray a very low rate of this Roundup, you can actually kill off that seed. And because the plant's an annual, it dies itself, and so you greatly reduce the amount of plants that are likely to come up the next year. So that's a couple of quite common ways to deal with it. There is a herbicide out. It's an expensive one. You need to do a bit of research on this, but the dairy industry actually used it to control barley grass about 4 to 6 weeks after the opening rains. It's pretty good in not damaging ryegrass, it will set back cocksfoot and phalaris a little bit, but that will bounce back. But you can do some research on this, because if you use yogurt and put a wetting agent with it, you'll probably wipe out your perennial grasses, which is not what you want. But if you use it and follow the directions, that's very effective in knocking out barley grass.
Now, James, you definitely would have come across this one.
Yeah, I see some pretty spectacular mouths with barley grass awns stuck in them. I have had a couple of cases where people have rung me in a panic, saying that their horse is not swallowing, it's salivating, it's hanging its head, they think it's dying, and we get out there and all its vitals are fine, but we sedate it and put a gag in its mouth, and its mouth is just full of the awns. They create horrible mucosal ulcerations in horses' mouths, and obviously they're at risk of creating eye ulcers and things like that too if they're getting stuck in the eyes. So definitely something to be wary of.
And Andy, this would also be in hay if you're not careful.
Yes, I mean it's fairly easy to spot in hay. The seeds are actually quite obvious. But yeah, I always say to people, if you've got a poor pasture, you've got poor quality hay. So this is something, if you're actually going to start cutting hay, that's one that you definitely need to get onto. And if you're serious about planting something in order just to cut it for hay, make sure that barley grass is completely wiped out the year before.
Yeah, so I guess what's crossing my mind is, with the drought and sending a lot of hay interstate, and then hay shortages potentially, because it still hasn't rained in some areas, that people may be buying hay from new sources or different sources, that it's still important to get a sample or get it checked, or someone to check it for you, if you can't have your local good supplier. Soursop.
Yeah, so soursop is an interesting one because it's obviously a bulb. Generally speaking, horses won't eat it, but you will get cases where some will. And this slide's actually indicating that miniature horses have been affected by it. It's not that easy to knock out. If you can use glyphosate and just spray it, but if you use glyphosate and spray it out, then you're killing everything in the paddock, which almost certainly means you're going to have to reseed that paddock. There is another one which you can use to control it, which is called brush off, which we mentioned before. You need to get this when the plants have grown to almost their full size. That's when they're most vulnerable. So I always say to people, if you look at the first one or two flowers that appear in the paddock, that's the time to actually spray with brush off, and you should better knock those out, and your grasses generally won't be affected, and certainly if they're slightly affected, they'll certainly bounce back. But certainly soursop is one that you need to spread so quickly, so you need to get onto those. Okay,
James, any comment from you?
I'll just ask a question of Andy, if that's all right. The brush off that you've mentioned a couple of times, it's a selective herbicide?
It's selective, right? So it's actually registered as a selective broadleaf herbicide. It's also a woody weed killer, and it's registered for you to kill bulbs. The only issue, and it'll come up in a slide later on, you do need to be really careful with this, because if you don't measure it out properly and you use 4 or 5 times the amount that's recommended, you can almost sterilise the soil for 12 months. So you do have to be very careful. It's incredibly safe for the user. There's no withholding period on it. None. It's one of the very rare ones, but environmentally it can do a lot of damage if you spray it near native veg. So, yeah.
Yep, cool. Yes, I've seen a few cases of soursop toxicity or oxalate poisoning in horses up at Gawler. It's a very rampant weed up there, and a lot of the sort of held theory was that horses wouldn't graze it if there was enough other pasture, but we've actually watched horses selectively pick out soursop for whatever reason. It seemed to taste good for them. So obviously you can have some of those sort of severe physiological problems with diaphragmatic flutters and stuff like that. We tended to see obviously the calcium leaching from bones, and you had on X-ray horses that look like, you know, osteoporotic 80-year-olds, which puts them at risk of fractures. You can have generalized joint disease and other such musculoskeletal problems as well.
Excellent. Okay. Flatweed, Andy?
Yeah, no, flatweed's a really common pasture weed. And in most cases, if you've only got a small percentage of it, I tend not to worry too much about it. But I have seen paddocks where it's absolutely dominant. And that's where you have an issue, because there appears to be a link between this particular weed and string hog. So where if you put a horse into a paddock which has got 90% flatweed, then you're asking for trouble. So it's a good idea to get rid of it. If it's so dense and you need to get rid of it, you probably have to reseed the pasture, right? But these are relatively easy to get rid of. They are a perennial broadleaf, and the two most common herbicides that can be used on small properties are dicamba and MCPA, which is Camba M. Its brand name is Camba M, or you can use 2,4-D-amine. If you apply those in April through to July, then that should pretty well knock this out.
Okay, and James?
Yeah, horrible condition, string halt. Early 2017, I saw a number of cases down here on the Flurio. And we had some that resolved, and we had unfortunately some that we had to euthanize. It got to the stage where it actually had progressive muscle paralysis, and it couldn't swallow properly, and it was getting aspiration pneumonia. So it can be pretty severe, and it will come on all of a sudden. They'll just keep eating, and then you'll come out one morning and find them presenting like that. So you've got to get onto it early before you see the signs. And there is no real effective treatment for it. There's a product called phenytoin, which we get compounded, which can help with some of the muscle spasms. We can use magnesiums and toxin binders, but they're not necessarily effective. It's individual case-by-case response, and really time is the only thing we've found and removal from the pasture that we've found to help. And I don't know if you've come across, they're not entirely sure what in flatweed causes the problem, but I think there was a New Zealand study that showed, we used to think it was a mycotoxin, but there's a potentially a direct plant toxin that's causing it. Have you read that at all?
No, I haven't. I know that there are some question marks about sort of its impact or how significant it is, but no, I haven't read that.
All right, I'll see if I can find the paper, and we might even share it, Julie, if
yeah, no, that'll be great, because again, Andy, is this another indicator for overgrazing?
Which one, the nightshade?
The flatweed.
Oh, the flatweed. Yes and no. I mean, it's one of those funny ones which tends to persist. It's a bit like the plantains. They can persist as well, even in quite good pastures. So yeah, I mean, capeweed definitely is one that pop up if you overgraze it. These tend to be around in reasonable sort of pastures and poor pastures. So yeah.
Okay. Right, we're on to nightshade now. Off you go.
Yeah, so silverleaf nightshade, you probably find those in the sort of lower rainfall areas. I saw some in a property down in Strathalbyn recently. And then there's black nightshade. They're both toxic. By and large, you don't see them en masse in paddocks. They tend to be sort of just isolated plants, which is quite good because you can rub them out. There's a better way to do it if you've only got a few.
Julie, we've just lost Andy there. It's gone quiet.
Oh, okay. Off you go. Keep talking, Andy.
Sorry. Okay. All right. Okay. Have you got me there?
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah. So in this case, if you need to spray them out, if you've got them en masse and you do need to spray them, you can use 2,4-D or the Amoside 625, but you need to mix it with picflorum, which is quite a potent herbicide. So if you can dig them out, you're better off doing that.
Now, I have seen notifications come through from the NRM board in the past for people to check hay for silverleaf nightshade that's come into the state. So that was a couple of years ago, but again, I'm just flagging, always thoroughly check your hay because it's plants like this that do remain toxic even though they're baled up.
Yeah, most. It's interesting how it's a good number of weeds which, if they're baled in hay, will hang around for months. In some cases, 18 months, 2 years. They will still have the toxin in them. So yeah, it's a really good idea to check and open bales up before you buy it.
Yeah, and I have seen this plant actually in around tie-up yards at public grounds that have horses there. So it's obviously come out of someone's hay or blown across the road from somewhere. But when horses are just standing in little polo yards or the 3x3 yards during the day while you go off and have lunch and they've got nothing else to do, again, it's just a situation where they could pick up the plant. Any comments on that one, James?
No, I think you've mostly all covered it. That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Now, heliotrope.
Yeah, so it's common heliotrope's a little bit different because this is actually a summer grower, but it seems in the last 2 or 3 years to have really popped up around the whole place, through the hills, even high rainfall areas, down on the plains, Adelaide Plains. You'll often find it through paddocks where people have sown cereal, and then they've taken the cereal grain off, even cut the stalks or baled them as straw. And so you've got quite bare ground, and this thing pops up. It is very toxic. It's one which if you've got it in your paddocks, I would suggest you that you actually definitely try and get rid of it. It's not too difficult to get rid of if you use a herbicide. If you've just got a handful of them in little patches, you can probably just rub them out. They're fairly easy to pull out, but they do tend to germinate over a fairly long time through that spring and sort of early summer when you get some rains. Common broadleaf herbicide scan, that Camber M, you can use. I've had a number of clients use that with reasonable success. Some people have said it's not quite as good as they'd hoped, and they've switched to Broad Strike, which is another general sort of selective herbicide. And that seems to have worked fairly well as well. But you're looking in October to December when these plants are actually actively growing. And remember, it's always better to get these plants when they're small and actively growing. You're going to use less herbicides, it's going to be more effective. But once again, you might need to do this over a 2-year period.
Thank you. Any comments on that one, James?
No, we have this pop up at the Pony Club as well. And yeah, it's that common summer weed that pops up and you think it's all dry and these things are coming up. It's obviously in the same class as your Salvation Jane for liver disease, so it's something to be avoided.
Okay, we're just moving on to weed control now. So perhaps we might just take a minute break there, James. If you could have a look at the questions. Is there any particular horse health questions related to plants?
So I've tried to keep. Oh, hang on, we've got a couple pop up. Andy, flatweed is self-seeding and spread through hays and livestock.
Yeah, I'm not sure how hard the seed is, but because of the nature of the seed is basically it flies in the air. That's the way it actually moves from place to place. So it's probably not going to pass through animals and still be viable at the end of it, like sort of Salvation Jane does. But because if you don't control it, then because it's windborne, these can spread quite a long way. That's the key issue.
Okay, excellent. Now I had just a quick one back on the biological controls for Salvation Jane. Do they have any detrimental effects to other crops or vines that people might be actively trying to promote?
No, they work really well on these. There's no evidence at all that they impact on any other type of crop or any of the pasture plants. So no, that was a good biological control, not like the cane toad.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to weed control. So again, we'll come back to questions at the end if you think of some more horse health ones. So, Andy, we're looking at integrated weed management. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, look, I think the thing when you're trying to control weeds is to step outside the line of thinking, I've got a weed, I need to spray it and get rid of it. Because if that weed goes, you're probably going to get another one in its place. So you don't want to be relying just on spraying them out. The less herbicide we can put out the place, the better. So if you can prevent weeds occurring in the first place by limiting their spread and not coming onto your property, such as looking at your hay and cleaning down the farm machinery that comes on with contractors, etc. Restricting the growth of weeds can be done by competing them out with good pastures. And if you overgraze, you're inviting weeds to come in. It's critical not to overgraze. The other thing which a lot of people tend to leave out is soil testing. Now, I go to some properties and they haven't soil tested for 15 years. And you can bet your life the soil's got very little, low levels of nutrients. You probably have to add lime because they're highly acidic. And this is encouraging weeds at the expense of the good pasture. So keep that in mind, and we'll talk a bit later about that one. And make sure your control methods are effective so that you follow the label instructions so that you don't find that it failed and you got to go back and do it again a second time and put out more herbicide.
Okay, I've just changed the slide. We're on lime acid soils now.
Yeah, so I mentioned before about the importance of looking at your soil. I'm constantly saying to people who want to reseed, don't forget to soil test and improve the level of your nutrients so that your pasture, when it gets sowed, has a chance to get up and be strong and healthy and try and compete out the weeds. This is something you can't leave out if you're trying to control weeds. A really poor soil, impoverished, highly acidic, is going to encourage weeds like crazy. So do a soil test, a laboratory soil test. It'll probably cost you about $150. It'll give you all the level of nutrients. And the one thing it will do is tell you how acidic it is. Now, if you're living in the hills with high rainfall, when we say high rainfall, anything of about 500 mil, then soils are naturally acidic. We can make them more acidic by adding particular types of fertilisers, particularly nitrogen fertilisers, or we can make them more acidic by cutting a lot of hay. So you need to look at that. And the way to deal with acid soils is to line them. And that can be anywhere from 2 to 5 tonnes, depending upon how acidic it is and your soil texture. So don't forget the importance of lining.
Okay, now we've got other control methods, including manual removal, mowing and slashing, if you'd like to speak to those.
Yeah, look, most of these are pretty common sense. We mentioned about grubbing individual plants out. Mowing and slashing is good to put some pressure onto your plants so they don't seed or produce as much seed. Grazing sheep and cattle is a good way to suppress weeds. Spray topping, I mentioned before, just this light rate of glyphosate to stop the seeds forming in some plants. And you can even try that with cake wheat. It has the same type of impact. And then finally, the last one which you mentioned before, which is just your outright spraying to control them.
Okay, and we're also looking at now different types of herbicide.
Yeah, now look, this is important when you're going to decide on what herbicides to use, because we've got non-selective ones, which are things like glyphosate, which kill everything. So if you go spraying that around the place, all you're going to do is create bare patches and up will come the weeds. So glyphosate is useful if you're spraying out a paddock to reseed it. It's useful around the house and yards for spot spraying. But if you've got a reasonable sort of paddock with sort of patches of weeds throughout and you want to keep the base pasture intact, then you need to go to selective herbicides. Some will kill grasses, but not damage broadleaf plants like fusilade. Others, like brush off, will control perennial broadleaf weeds, bulbs, etc. But it'll leave your grasses intact. And that little photograph on the right there actually is showing you that herbicide Shogun, which has knocked out the barley grass and left all of the clover intact. That's just an example of it being highly selective.
Okay, and we've talked about off-target damage a little bit earlier. I actually asked you that question. So,
this slide here is quite good because if you see at the base of those three eucalypts which are dead, that's gorse which somebody sprayed with brush off. And they soaked it in brush off. They've obviously used too much. It's gone into the ground. The roots of the eucalypts have absorbed it, and they're now dead. So you do have to be very, very careful when you're using brush off, and even things like piclorum, and there's a whole host of others, that you don't spray too close to native veg, because you have some serious off-target damage.
Andy, just block your ears for a second. If you've got self-seeded baby eucalypts in your pasture, direct spraying with a mixture of glycophosphate and brush off is really good, with a bit of pulse wetting agent to control some of those pesky little regrowths.
No, that's a good way. If you can use that on difficult pastures and difficult weeds, yeah, and that's often used as a precursor to reseeding pastures.
Okay, Andy, we're on common herbicides and with the brush off notice there.
Yeah, there's just a couple of things here. Whatever, if you're doing the spraying, read the label. It will tell you heaps of information. It'll tell you about safety measures. It'll tell you about environmental limitations. It'll tell you about plant back times, because some herbicides, if you use them, so you have to wait a few weeks before you can go planting things back, particularly like legumes. It'll tell you whether or not you need a wetting agent. It'll give you the precise levels of the herbicide per hectare, and that's what you need to put out, so many litres per hectare. Okay, so always read the label before you use the herbicide.
And calibration?
Yeah, now, any spraying machine, even if it's a 15-litre backpack, should be calibrated so you know how much you're putting out over a square metre or a hectare. Now, it's not easy, it's not hard to do. You just need to make sure that when your machine's actually operating at a particular speed with a certain amount of pressure and nozzles, or setting of the nozzles, that you know how much you're actually putting out over a given area, and then you can put in your chemical herbicide to make sure you're putting out the right rate. So that's really important. And if you can Google any of the primary industry sites, they will actually tell you how you can go about it. It's a simple sort of mathematical process, and you can just follow that through and get your machine calibrated.
All right, and weed management plans?
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, if you've got serious weed problems, you've just got one small paddock, it's only a hectare, you've got one particular weed, it's probably easier to deal with, but if you've got a series of weeds in different paddocks and they are fairly major problems, then make sure you identify the weed, that you map the weed, because you can do patch spraying in a paddock. You don't have to spray the whole paddock if it's only sort of one patch in one corner. Prioritise those weeds that you need to control, work out what your options are, because you'll all have choices about how you can actually deal with some of these weeds, and make sure it's a realistic control timetable, and go back and monitor and make sure that you are on top of what's actually happening once you've sprayed, and don't just assume that yes, you've sprayed it, therefore they're all died out. Something may have gone amiss, you may still have lots there. But a weed management plan is something you can follow, and that should make your actions much more effective.
So if people need help with some putting a plan together, which is probably actually part of a bigger property management plan, the NRM boards will have people that can help, and I'll just flag that if you're Googling in the near future, natural resource management boards are changing their name to Landscapes SA. So that's a shift that will happen after the 1st of July. Okay, that's our last slide, so thank you.